Hello, take two. This is Brian from Transylvania, and I am going to take a slight departure from Second Corinthians and read a passage from Matthew chapter 6. This is Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, and we're going to be talking about fasting. Now, there's a lot of ideas about fasting, there's a lot of different traditions with fasting, and kind of traditions branching off from fasting, putting off something for Lent, and the more modern putting something on for Lent. And we're going to talk about all those. None of those things are necessarily bad, though there are some general health principles that you want to consider. Drink water. Always drink water. Don't ever stop drinking water. That's not going to. God understands that you need to be hydrated for your own safety. Please drink water when you fast. Let's dive into this passage. I'm going to stop every now and then to reflect on some of the things being said. It's a short one. This is a request from my wonderful wife, Madalena, and it's good here in Romania because a lot of people practice fasting, and a lot of people might have questions about it. So let's look at this. Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, fasting. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show they are fasting. Oh, for God, I do this not for myself, in front of all of you, sort of thing. Jesus is saying don't do that. Don't disfigure your face. Don't start saying, oh, look at my holiness. That doesn't help you. He goes on to say, I tell you the truth, they have their reward in full, because their reward is a show. Their reward is showing the world, hey, this guy, he's religious. Don't turn your fasting into an act of branding your religiosity. You should not do that. Christ is telling you don't do this. That is a bad way to fast. Now, that actually makes me think about the way some traditions have done fasting, and I don't know if it's necessarily bad. You have traditions that say, we're going to fast from this day onto this day because it's our official calendar days of fasting. This is how we do it as a church. We've done it for a long time. It's like, okay, so you're all in this together in a community thing. That can be good. It could be good in that you could have community sincerity, or it could be bad in that you have the hypocritical religiosity that Jesus is talking about. So it's something to consider. Something very, very important to consider. Now let's continue. Verse 17. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. So don't go out and try to make yourself look like, oh, this is so hard, but I'm doing it. Oh, God. Go out like you normally would do. Put on your clothes, wash your face. Their culture, they would perfume themselves with oil. Don't make a big deal about your fasting is what Christ is telling us to do. He's telling us to do this, as it says in verse 18, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father. So you want this to stand out to God the Father, who is unseen, and your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And that could be a spiritual reward. That could be the reward of just being closer to Him, which is fantastic. As Christians, we should all endeavor to do that. Now, and this is why in my opinion, fasting is a very personal thing. And I've seen people go the reverse direction of this. I've seen people say, you know what, I can't tell anybody that I'm fasting. I can't let them know what will happen if they find out. They'll think I'm arrogant. It's like, no, they won't. Especially if they're another Christian. In Bible universities, Christian institutions, churches, I've come across people who are fasting all the time, and I'll usually find out this way. It's like, hey, you want to grab a cup of coffee? Can't. It's like, you don't like coffee? No, I can't tell you why. And then it gets weird. It's you can tell your brothers and sisters you're fasting, tell other Christians you're fasting, and not be considered arrogant. Don't go the extreme route and say, I can't tell anyone, because that's ridiculous too. You can casually say, yeah, I'm fasting. And I think most reasonable people, especially Christians, will say, oh, okay, good for you. And maybe you can tell them more about it. Maybe they'll want to know more about it. That kind of communication is good. But I think it's best to avoid making a big dramatic show of it. And it's best to avoid trying to hide it. I don't think so that it will not be obvious means that you're actively hiding anything. I don't believe that's what's going on. Now, you have different traditions. You have churches doing things on the church calendar from this day to this day. We are fasting. And I don't think that's bad. I do think that if in those situations you have to watch your heart, you have to say, hey, I'm doing this for God. I'm going to keep going out, living my life like I normally would, but I know God sees this. And that's great. You have to be careful in those situations where you're specifically going to the church and having these, like, I don't know, fasting festivals where you're telling everybody, you think, yes, I'm doing this for God because I am so religious. The priest sees me, you see me, the town sees me. Look how religious I am. Not helping. That's exactly what Christ told us to avoid doing. But you could be in a very healthy community where you're doing this together. It could be a prayer group, it could be a local church that says, hey, we're going to be fasting about this subject, or we're going to be fasting in this period of time. And we're doing this for the sake of coming closer to God. That works. That works. I find that it's funny how so many things rely on the intentions. And sincere, good intentions for fasting are really, really what we need. Now, we have things that kind of branch off from fasting and take a little turn. We have Lent, where people, especially in Ireland, people, they give up something for Lent, which is fasting-ish. It's like, I'm going to quit smoking for Lent, is one I've heard. I'm going to not eat any sweets for Lent. I'm going to, I've had some students give up social media for Lent, give up Facebook for Lent. That's a more modern interpretation of it. Another modern interpretation is to not necessarily put something off for Lent, but put something on for Lent. When I lived in Ireland my first year, I put on doing 100 sit-ups a day for Lent, because this is, how the people around me were approaching Lent. So this was my approach, and I had a good. It was fun. It was a good time. I think that I bonded with a lot of my brothers and sisters in Christ uh, during the time of Lent. People were putting on things, uh, putting away things, and it was a generally positive experience. Now, I don't think it's necessarily absolutely what's happening here, because this does not necessarily sound like a group thing. This sounds like a personal thing. But yet, you can do group fast if that's the tradition. Just check your heart with God before and see how you're doing it. Some people don't necessarily need to do it. If they're like, well, yeah, this is simply my relationship with God. It's something that I'm doing. Uh, that's great. That's fantastic. Keep doing that. But if you find yourself to be the kind of person who thinks of your relationship with God as a form of branding yourself with a kind of religiosity, you might want to step back a little bit, because Christ is telling us not to do that. Also, for those of you who have the sincere heart of fasting, you should know it's okay to tell people around you you're fasting, especially if they're Christians. It's going to be more normal to them than it is other people. And they're not necessarily going to call you arrogant. And if they stop you and say, "Oh, you shouldn't have told me," you could point out that it says you're not trying to make it obvious, but nowhere here does it say hide it. It doesn't say to hide it. It says don't make it obvious the way that arrogant people are making it obvious. If your heart is right while you're fasting, then you don't have to worry about it. Okay, well that is a video on fasting, and I hope that that everybody's doing well. If you like this, feel free to like this video, share it, or subscribe. All those things are helpful. I'm Brian Lee Davidson, and I still have a dream of starting a church here in Romania, so please pray for that. God bless. Take care.